Hello humans and welcome back to the Housepod, a podcast where we explore practical issues and applications of faith. I'm Natalie Kendel, a theologian and pastor here at the House, and I'm joined today by our guests, Angelica Nettleford, a researcher in colonial history and Western imperial expansion, who will be sharing her insights into the topic we're exploring today. And I am also joined by Robert Hacking, who has written several articles on the Palestinian genocide and British colonial rule in the Middle East. Thank you, Angelica and Robert, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure having you both speak with us today. Before we do get into the details, I'm going to briefly introduce today's topic. We're going to be exploring a phenomenon found within colonization and the propaganda surrounding it, particularly pertaining to white supremacist colonial projects, namely the projecting of the colonizer. White colonizers have historically projected their own negative qualities, such as violence, fear, hatred, ignorance, insecurity, and even lack of hygiene, onto the colonized populations. This dynamic, which has been analysed in post-colonial studies, psychology, and history, explains how colonizers justified their oppression by externalizing their own flaws onto the people they dominated. This process of projection allows colonizers to rationalize their brutal actions, enabling them to dehumanize indigenous populations and justify the violence and subjugation that accompanied colonization. In understanding how this psychological dynamic unfolds, we gain better insight into both the mindset of the colonizer, how the propaganda and lies they tell us are so effective, and the long-lasting effects of colonialism on those who are colonized. Now, before we proceed, just so we're all on the same page, projecting, specifically psychological projection, has been defined as a defense mechanism where individuals attribute their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or motives to another person. We can give an example of this. An employee at a company who frequently talks about others might baselessly accuse colleagues of spreading rumors about them. Another common example, which is, according to marriage counselors, very common, is a cheating spouse will often suspect their partner of being unfaithful and might respond with controlling, suspicious, or jealous behavior. Now, similarly, any white colonization has relied on projecting onto the people being displaced, murdered, and colonized the cause of the colonizer and his ability to get others on board with his plans will always depend on his ability to spin the tale of his own victimhood and the need for defense to hide the true face of his own villainy and aggression. History is full of this sort of messaging. The Red Indian is savage. They will kill us all if we don't kill them first. The natives won't share their resources with us. We have to take it from them by force. The African is bloodthirsty and we must protect ourselves by subjugating them. So, Angelica, would you share with us some specific instances from history where this phenomenon of colonizers projecting plays out?
Yes, of course. History is riddled with these examples, but I can name a few. Asher 1, the Spanish conquest of the Americas. During the Spanish colonization of the Americas in the 16th century, indigenous populations, including the Aztecs, Maya, and Inca, were portrayed by Spanish conquistadors as barbaric, violent, and in need of Christian salvation. One of the most well-known examples of projection was the Spanish condemnation of human sacrifices performed by the Aztecs, which they labelled as savage and bloodthirsty. Meanwhile, the conquistadors themselves committed extreme acts of violence, including massacres, forced labour, and the destruction of entire indigenous civilizations. The Spanish justified their brutality under the guise of a civilizing mission and religious conversion, projecting their own violent conquest onto the indigenous people by portraying them as the savage other. The British in India, Sepoy Rebellion, 1857. The British colonisers often depicted Indian society as backward, barbaric, and prone to irrational violence. This was particularly evident during the Sepoy Rebellion, or Indian Rebellion of 1857, when Indian soldiers, sepoys, rebelled against the British East India Company. The British labelled the rebels as mutinous savages, describing their resistance as evidence of Indian barbarism. However, the brutal response from the British, who massacred civilians, destroyed entire villages and executed rebels, was far more violent. The British projection of irrationality and savagery onto the Indian people masked their own deep fears of losing control over the colony and justified their violent repression of the uprising. French colonisation of Algeria, 1830 to 1962, the French portrayed Algerians, particularly the Muslim population, as inherently violent, uncivilised and incapable of self-governance. The French viewed the Algerian resistance movements, such as those led by figures like Abdelkader, as irrational acts of fanaticism. In reality, the colonisers themselves engaged in brutal tactics to suppress resistance, including massacres, forced relocations, and systematic torture, particularly during the Algerian War of Independence, 1954 to 1962. The French projected their own violence onto the Algerians, portraying them as a threat to European civilization, while ignoring the violent colonial practices they used to maintain control. The Hero and Nama genocide in Namibia, 1904 to 1908. In what is considered one of the first genocides of the 20th century, German colonisers in Namibia, then German Southwest Africa, portrayed the Herero and Nama people as subhuman and rebellious. After the Hero and Nama tribes rose in resistance against German colonial rule, the Germans responded with extreme violence, committing mass killings and forcing the Hero and Nama into the desert to die of starvation and dehydration. German colonial rhetoric painted the Hero and Nama as violent and primitive, using this projection to justify the genocidal tactics they employed. The Germans accused the indigenous populations of being a threat to peace, while it was the colonial forces that unleashed indiscriminate violence.
I know you also wrote an article on the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya.
Yes, indeed. The British in Kenya, Mau Mau uprising, 1952 to 1960. During the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, which was a revolt against British colonial rule, the British government and media depicted the Kikuyu rebels as barbaric and bloodthirsty terrorists. The term Mau Mau itself was used to conjure images of savage violence and irrational rebellion, despite the fact that the uprising was rooted in legitimate grievances over land dispossession and colonial exploitation. The British response was to imprison, torture and kill thousands of Kenyans, often in brutal detention camps. This projection of savagery onto the Mau Mau fighters allowed the British to conceal the systemic violence of colonial rule and justified their use of repressive and inhumane measures to maintain control.
Hearing these examples, there seems to be an echoing and re-echoing style of white colonial oppression, with similar themes and even language being recycled in each case of trying to demonize the indigenous population.
Yes, that's exactly right. These examples illustrate how colonizers across different periods and regions used projection to maintain their power. By attributing violence, irrationality, and barbarism to the colonized, they obscured their own acts of brutality and oppression.
Right, this chronic demonization of the very people whose land, lives, freedom, food, family, dignity, work, and culture is being stolen. These stories and this language leave such a deep mark on our collective psyche. The generations later, children are still playing cowboys and Indians, featuring this savage and mysterious, subhuman character who grunts words and wears a feather in their hair. And I myself am half Arab, I'm half Lebanese, and I have a very distinct memory of watching Disney's 1992 movie Aladdin. The makers of that film were very happy to open the story with the song Arabian Nights, that has the lyrics, "It's chaotic, but hey, it's home," to describe a fictional Middle Eastern location, which was in fact based on the city of Baghdad. This hotter than hot, chaotic mess that is apparently all of Arabia or the Middle East. So these characterizations, although some may scoff and say they are distant history and have nothing to do with us, they sift into every layer of Western psyche and worldview. And those images of other people on this planet can predict and steer the knee-jerk reaction and attitudes that white Western people have to global issues. If our narratives through our child's play and movies and political language depict certain other peoples as the bad guys, while the West is the good guys, of course this will affect attitudes and prejudices. Western police forces are still being trained to profile civilians with darker skin as being more likely to be hostile or a threat. In fact, white projection can be seen loud and clear in Western police forces. Angelica, what are some more of the specific language that has been used to demonize colonized peoples?
During the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Pedro de Alvarado projected their own violent tendencies onto the Aztecs by emphasizing practices like human sacrifice. These acts were used to dehumanize the Aztec people, justify the brutal massacres committed by the Spaniards, and depict the colonizers as civilizing agents. The Toxcatl massacre, where Spaniards attacked unarmed Aztec nobles during a religious festival, is a key example. This massacre was part of a broader genocidal strategy under the guise of preventing supposed Aztec treachery. Justification of massacres in the Spanish Caribbean, Massacre of Zaragua. In Hispaniola, the Massacre of Zaragua in 1503 was another instance where Spanish authorities framed indigenous resistance as treachery to justify mass killings. Spanish officials led by Nicolás de Ovando orchestrated the killing of the Taíno people under the pretext that they were planning a rebellion. In reality, these massacres were part of the larger colonial effort to suppress indigenous autonomy and seize control of resources. The British projection of savage traits onto the Irish, 16th century. During the Elizabethan conquest of Ireland, the English framed the Irish as barbaric and wild, using this narrative to justify their violent suppression and colonisation efforts. The English constructed the Irish as inherently disorderly, backward and violent, even as they themselves used scorched earth tactics and brutal repressions. Source: How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatiev and God's Executioners by Micheál Siochrú. For Dutch colonial rule in South Africa, Hottentots. The Dutch settlers in South Africa, Boers, demonised the Khoi people, derogatorily called Hottentots, labelling them as lazy and uncivilised to justify expropriating their land. While the Khoi practised nomadic pastoralism, the Dutch settlers imposed their agrarian systems and enforced racial hierarchies, portraying the Khoi's lifestyle as evidence of their inferiority.
Yes, remind me of the book where one can read about the colonial rule in South Africa.
Colonial South Africa, History of Dutch Imperialism by John Lonsdale.
Right, thank you for that. And then we have the much more recent European colonization of Algeria by France and the resistance which surrounded that as well.
Yes, indeed. French colonization in Algeria, 1830s. During France's colonization of Algeria, French colonists projected their fears and moral judgments onto the indigenous Muslim population. They depicted Algerians as fanatical and inherently violent, using this as a pretext to justify the brutal subjugation, forced displacement, and cultural suppression of the local population.
So European colonizers systematically constructed this image of the colonized as the other, an alien, inferior, and often threatening presence. The savage native in America, the fanatical Asian, the uncivilized African. And these images, as you put it so well, justify the need for domination and control by white colonizers. And of course, ironically, the characteristics that colonizers projected were reflections of their own behavior. They accused indigenous populations of being violent and barbaric, even as they waged wars of conquest, slaughtered communities, imposed systems of forced labor. They labelled the colonized as lazy or backward, even as they plundered their resources, destroyed local communities, and imposed arbitrary legal systems that often disrupted social cohesion. Again, the colonized were depicted as morally inferior or sexually deviant. If you want to read more about that, I can suggest Ruby Hamad's White Tears, Brown Scars, an excellent book to read. Though it was often the colonizers who imposed oppressive and dehumanizing racial hierarchies and exploited women and men alike under the guise of racial supremacy.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Now, for anyone who is following the ethnic cleansing and genocide that is taking place in Palestine right now, and has been for over 70 years, these tactics, which Angelica has talked about, which we've mentioned here, will certainly ring familiar. Robert, would you share some thoughts on how this colonizers projecting is playing out currently in Palestine?
Yes. The Israeli occupation of Palestine is no different to past white colonial projects and imperial conquest, some of which Angelica did so well to sum up. Before so-called Israel was illegally declared a state in 1948, the refugees turned colonizers instigated violence and oppression towards a native Palestinian population, a population who had welcomed and accepted these Jewish refugees from Europe following the Holocaust. But every step of the way, the Israeli occupation has spun a narrative about the Palestinians. And it's not some fringe off-to-the-side narrative spoken only by extremists. It is mainstream language, picked up and reused by Western news channels, by Western politicians, and used by those in highest office to justify what is happening in Palestine, in the concentration camp of Gaza and beyond. This narrative about Palestinians is depicting them as terrorists, dangerous, violent, cruel, backward, and threatening to Jewish survival. The Israeli occupation's insistence on the violent Palestinian or Muslim had no basis in reality, demonstrated by the fact that Jews, Muslims, and Christians had lived in peace in Palestine before 1948. But Zionists have pushed the bad Palestinians story for 75 plus years to drown out that reality. This was the story called upon to explain the events of October 7th, 2023. The reality was that Israeli colonizers were having a rave right next to a concentration camp. The reality, as it now has been confirmed and proved publicly, is that the Israelis did apply the Hannibal Directive and murdered their own civilians on October 7th. The reality of Palestine is that the occupation refused to share the land they were guests in. The Israeli occupation refused to be integrated with the natives. The occupation has slaughtered, stolen, raped, dehumanized, vandalized, and assaulted since its conception. And here comes the insanity of it. Any meager, desperate attempt by Palestinian civilians to protect or defend their family members and neighbors who were being ruthlessly murdered and violated was then repurposed and spun into a resounding confirmation. See the Palestinian aggression. You see these ruthless Arabs? We told you what they're like.
Right, and Western audiences eat it up. They eat up the lie that Hamas are terrorists and extremists instead of being what they are, native resistance fighters, resisting occupation and Israeli terror. Israeli settlers eat it up because it confirms the fear they've been taught to feel over and over again. And that's how we get these ridiculous videos of Zionists on the streets of Tel Aviv. You know, a woman lying on the ground, appearing to protectively cover her children's heads while singing a lullaby to them in an apparent attempt to comfort them, pretending to hide from some non-existent bombs that Hamas in that moment fired at them. Well, now, whether that woman and many others that have been caught on tape was pretending to forward the Zionist propaganda, or whether she and others genuinely have been whipped into a fear frenzy that would make her mistake a plane overhead for a Hamas-sent missile, I don't know. But I have no doubt many Israeli colonizers genuinely believe the propaganda and the narrative, because the fear is real. And in the West, adding excessively to the flame of this propaganda is the Western hatred of Arabs, Western Islamophobia, and this underlying racism. The already laid foundation of hatred only reinforces the portrait being painted of Palestinians, just like it was about Iraqis, the Lebanese, the Syrians, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Afghans. It is actually breathtaking, the impossible situation Palestinians find themselves in. Do we die quietly like lambs led to slaughter, not resisting, not objecting, not defending our toddlers as they are shot in the head, our children as they are stolen because their hair is blonde, our family as they are bombed to the point of there being nothing left to bury of their bodies except organs in a plastic bag? Or do we dare do something else at all and seem to confirm every horrible thing that has ever been said about us? If this were a Hollywood movie and the protagonists were white, this story would be a much beloved story of epic heroes, heroes of resistance and courage. Hamas would be portrayed as Robin Hood and his merry men.
Yes, that's right. They would be seen as heroes. In fact, I would strongly recommend that our listeners watch a YouTube video where author Priyamvada Gopal is being interviewed by Verso Books. Perhaps we can pop that in this video's description.
Yes, I can do that.
In this video, Gopal is explaining the ideas and theories behind her new book, Insurgent in Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Descent. This book and what she talks about is all about the forgotten history of resistance. Resistance fighters, rebels against colonial oppression. This narrative that white audiences look away from and morally judge, despite the fact that when the story is framed as Luke and his resistance fighters fighting against the evil empire in Star Wars, suddenly rooting for the resistance makes loads of sense.
Right.
Norwegians applaud the story of the Norwegian resistance movement who, between 1940 and 1944, carried out a series of sabotage actions, including bombing a heavy water production plant in Nazi-occupied Norway. Why is it when a white Norwegian on skis sets off a bomb to sabotage the occupation's plans that it's heroism and brave, not terrorism and barbaric?
Yes, I heard that story a lot growing up in Norway, and I've seen the movie of it as well.
Right, exactly. Of course there's a movie.
Yeah. I remember reading Arundhati Roy, an Indian author and activist, when she stated, "The only moral thing Palestinian civilians can do, apparently, is to die." But there are many people on this planet who see the truth of Palestinian resistance and see through the fabricated narrative. Stand-up comedian Amer Rahman said, "All colonized people see themselves in Palestine. They see some aspect of what has been done to them in Palestine. All colonizers see themselves in Israel." In the States, many Black Americans glimpse their own plight in the eyes of the Palestinians, for they too know the reality of holding up their hands and begging not to be shot just for breathing, for living in darker skin, for defending their loved ones, for daring to exist. They know the reality of having their Black Panthers demonized, their leaders called terrorists, their resistance to annihilation being deemed a greater crime than the annihilation itself, of being viewed as an automatic threat, of bearing the projections of the white man and being fashioned into the false image of their oppressors. I can say that my entire understanding of the mission and actions of the Black Panther movement was completely changed last year, and I would invite any listeners who have need of this to experience a re-education of that history, because what I was taught at school is simply not true. Resistance stories are fumbled or downright covered up. But yes, ironically, there's something else also happening in the West. The Western fear of the Palestinians is just a disguised sibling to the fear and hatred they had towards Jews before, during, and after the horrific events of the Jewish Holocaust. Many of the same people who now shout anti-Semitism when they hear people protesting the Palestinian genocide would have been shouting Tote de Juden if they lived in Nazi Germany. It's not that these people love Jews so much, it's that they hate the Arabs more. And history is stuck on a loop, and so many white people never, ever, ever learn. Just like we see demonstrated in Germany right now with mass police violence, arrests, harassment, threats towards Palestinians and pro-Palestinian protesters, Germany has managed once again to be on the wrong side of history. A majority of white people never truly see themselves as the vehicle of evil in the world. They cling to the victim role like damsels in distress while wiping their bloodied blades on their skirts. The blinders are superglued on, the fiction of the savage native lives on, and because so many white colonizers are ignorant about their own projecting practices, they remain ignorant of their own guilt and monstrousness. Thus today we see the occupying Israeli mothers and children crying crocodile tears in the streets of Tel Aviv, broadcasted on our news stations each night. Pantomime colonizers, screaming about how we need to be safe. They will kill us all if we let them. Therefore we must defend ourselves. We must get them first. Sound familiar?
It does. It's the same tactics which the Israelis are now applying to justify their attacks and attempted invasion of Lebanon. All Lebanese are now talked about as though they are threats. The Israelis use Hezbollah as some sort of trigger word for Western racists who don't even know what that word means.
Yeah.
As Hamas was, Hezbollah is painted as a threat. Threats must be eliminated. And now. And here's where the sleight of hand happens. The Israelis now conflate Hezbollah with every Lebanese citizen. We heard it just recently on the news. Netanyahu saying that Lebanese people have rockets beneath their homes and in their kitchens. See, now every Lebanese is a threat. The Israeli Minister of Education, Yoav Kish, stated, "There is no difference between Hezbollah and Lebanon. Lebanon will be annihilated. It will cease to exist." Meanwhile, here again we have projection. Tel Aviv has military infrastructure everywhere in the city, embedded in civilian neighborhoods. They have built bunkers beneath civilian housing to have the Israeli military command and control structure there, so that when Iran responds to Israeli aggression with missiles and Iran bombs military structure, the Israeli doesn't only use Palestinians as human shields, they use their own people.
Every accusation is an admission.
Right, exactly. The way Zionists talk about the Lebanese is just like how they talked about Palestinians. When Netanyahu and the top officials of their government can say that all Palestinian children are terrorists, they will all grow up to be terrorists. While addressing the U.S. Congress, Netanyahu called the entire Middle East a backwater of repression and stated that he, with Western partners, will reform it into a thriving oasis. And Congress responded with roaring applause.
Yeah. Valaria Corsi wrote, "You will be told by others, the deaths of Palestinian children are unfortunate but inevitable, because it is the only way Israel is safe from terror, and Hamas brought this on its own people." How deeply disturbing and twisted it is that the aggressor should play the victim, that the oppressor should call defense when they are the only cause of any real threat. The hateful, fearful mind of the colonizer is a cannibal. It feasts on itself. It sees monsters in others while being themselves the only monstrous creature in a nightmare of their own making. This colonizer's projection that we're talking about has been a recycled lie which white imperialists have told about the peoples they have eliminated and oppressed since the beginning, on the soils of Australia, South Africa, India, the US. And this is the lie of the Israeli terrorist state. The lie we are told and retold, packaged and repackaged in so many overt and covert ways that in the end it's hard for many Westerners to even realize they have fallen victim to Zionist propaganda.
I often think about how Palestine supporters use the phrase, every Israeli accusation is an admission, and this is what they are referring to, the colonizers' long-standing tradition of projecting their own image onto the colonized. Every fact-checked detail of Israeli claims about Palestinian crimes has been, on closer examination, debunked and rebounded 100 times over. But by the time one of their lies is proven false, they're on to the next, and the next. The propaganda machine churns it out so quickly that accountability and correction get run over. Hannah Arendt, a German historian and philosopher who lived 1906-1975, said about Nazi Germany, this constant lying is not aimed at making the people believe a lie, but at ensuring that no one believes anything anymore.
That was well said, Robert. It's kind of unbelievable to watch it unfold in real time.
Yes, it is. The lies and the Israeli propaganda has certainly been aggressive and insane. The lie of 40 beheaded Israeli babies made it around the world twice, spewed like poison out of the US president's own mouth, and landed unchallenged in most Western homes before it finally was revealed to be completely an Israeli fabrication. Meanwhile, in just 4 short months, the Israelis have murdered over 10,000 Palestinian babies and children between October 2023 and January 2024. I and others have personally seen babies without their heads, toddlers shot in the head, infants with half their body missing as their wailing parents cling to them. Projecting is very much the reality of the Israeli-led information war surrounding the oppression of the Palestinians. A huge part of fighting Zionism is starting to peel back the mask to reveal the colonizer's true face. When we truly see that face, the colonizer's lie about the indigenous people crumbles into a self-damning heap of ashes. The projection reveals itself to be none other than a self-portrait, and we must bravely stare into the bloodshot eyes of that hideous but accurate beast, even if it injures our white sensitivities. Even if we are frightened by change, even if we have to face that we were wrong. Otherwise, we go on parroting our forefathers who stained the earth with innocent indigenous blood, and we remain their unchanged children, children of white colonization and imperialism. Confronting the projections we've swallowed means confronting our false narratives, internalized prejudices, self-righteousness, white victimhood, white savior complex, poisoned information sources, and oafish complacency. It means having the humility to actively pursue correct narratives from the correct sources, told by a far more reliable narrator, namely the indigenous and the oppressed. The victim is the reliable narrator, not the offender. Author Cole Arthur Riley wisely wrote for Black liturgies, "The oppressor can never be trusted as historian. Our task is preservation. Collective memory is a liberation practice. Remember and tell it." If we don't actively not only question but dismantle the colonizers' projections, and instead fail to listen to the true narrative, we will once again be enabling the oppressor's lie. We will be guilty of propping up this horrendous mask that covers the abomination. And I'd like to give our listeners today a challenge. Next time you listen to Israelis and Zionists describe Palestinians and Lebanese, I challenge you to notice their language. Notice the adjectives they use: savage, non-humans, human animals, terrorists. What things do they liken Palestinians to? How do they describe their behavior, their motives, their nature? What is this portrait they're painting of the human beings they're genociding? Can you see it? That glistening surface of a mirror. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Housepod. Thank you, Angelica Nettleford, for joining us. And thank you, Robert Hacking.
Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure coming on the Housepod. You seem to be doing good work here. God bless you.
Thank you very much. And to our listeners, we'll return next time for a new episode and a new topic. If you want to check out some of the sources used for today's research, you can find those cited in the description box below. Until next time, may the God of true faces and true narratives open our eyes and hearts to see the world and ourselves as they truly are.